Greetings, friends. Wanningerski here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of December 27th, or no, November 27th to December 3rd. It's one of those weeks that last throughout 2 months. So, this week we have a lot of updates. So, basically, the Russians are on the offensive along basically the entire front almost. We will begin in the Donetsk area because there's a lot of updates for that. And we will begin with Avdiivka as usual, because this is where a lot of the major clashes are happening. But clashes are going on everywhere. Let's begin in the south. The Russian, as we mentioned last week, the main effort was trying to capture this industrial zone. And this week, the Russians managed to capture and clear out the dachas to the west of the industrial zone. So now the Ukrainians retreated back to the residential area, and the Russians are consolidating themselves on this industrial point. So they cleared up the dachas which they didn't do last week, but they completed it this week. And now, basically, I expect them, after they consolidate, to attack and start entering the residential area. We mentioned this last week, but because once they get into the residential area, they could cut off the Tsar's hut, which is one of the main AFU Ukrainian defense points, and they also could get to the back of this Donetsk filtration system. This will force the Ukrainians to withdraw from these areas, and that would be catastrophic because these are really fortified areas that the Ukrainians built up since 2014. Another thing to mention in the south of Ukraine is that the Russians have relaunched offensive operations towards Severna. A lot of mappers are now saying that this tree line right in front of Severna is basically almost entirely under Russian control. Not only did they advance closer to the Severna, they advanced northwest of Severna, I think they're trying to cut one of the roads that leads from Severna to these high-rise buildings of Avdiivka. So the Russians advanced in the south from Vodana to the northeast, to the front, to the north, and then also they advanced a bit more along the Novoavdiivska lake here. So they're probably somewhere around here, and this, I'm kind of surprised that, so the Ukrainians are all, trying to hold up the Russian advance in the south of Peremyska, prevent them from going up, but the Russians are now going to the north here, and we'll probably see a Russian effort to take Peremyska in the near future and push the Ukrainians back, probably take this village too, and then push the Ukrainians back towards the main, where they want the Ukrainians, and where the Ukrainians want to be if they lose Avdiivka, along this kind of line of this river, where all these villages and towns kind of create a natural defense point, so the Ukrainians can actually defend this area. But the Russians don't really want to pass this area because, once they capture all these villages, the whole purpose of this operation is to push Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk. So instead of artillery being here, where they get to shell it with regular artillery, if the Ukrainians are forced to push back here, the artillery will be, here somewhere. And that's too far away. They'll be able to shell, maybe these villages, but they won't be able to shell the center of Donetsk, which is what they've been able to do. But the Russians are advancing. Basically getting closer and closer to Severna. What makes this village so hard to take is that all these fields are mined to hell, so every single point needs to be thoroughly taken. And the thing about it is that if the Russians take, they attack and land troops here, the Ukrainians just bomb this area. And so it's very hard to secure yourself. You have to take a piece by piece, and then secure it, and the Ukrainians obviously will counterattack. So this is a very heavily mined area. But despite those, the Russians are on the attack. I think they are going to try to occupy Severna, which obviously, but we don't know when they'll directly attack it. Maybe they are improving their positions to maybe try to reach this line, maybe try to advance somewhere here, and try to get Severna on the side so that, if they enter this village, the Ukrainians can't just attack from three sides and take it back. They want to secure their gain in Severna before attacking it directly. So there's been some gains. The Russians made it here. They advanced over here and took this tree line. They advanced closer here. and they also advanced up to this tree line. A lot of Rybar, for example, said they already reached this line, but the map I'm using just confirmed that they reached this line today as well, or not today, but during this week. So the south is active, but the more intense clashes are happening in the north. Let us begin with the main focus of this, which is the village of Stepova, which we've been talking about for November. During this week, the Russians were pushed out of the village, and they actually went back to their main defense line on this rail line. However, the Ukrainians managed to enter the western part of Stepova again. However, by the end of the week, the Russians launched a major offensive and are starting to attack, trying to gain. There's been Russian advances to try to take these two tree lines right here. You can see this tree line and this tree line. And basically, they've been fighting to the north of Stepova. We haven't had confirmation that they captured these two these two tree lines, but there's been fighting for them. We've also seen Russian troops attacking Ukrainian troops in this area. And so they've been trying to capture this tree line and probably try to advance along this tree line and secure themselves to the north of the Avdiivka plant. And then the other thing is that they did a direct assault and retook. This map says they took the eastern part of the village. The eastern part. A lot of other mappers say they've taken maybe the center part. But regardless, the whole purpose of this is that they could have a solid bridgehead. They were attacking to the north, to the south, and directly, so they could capture this village. Where I believe they're going to try to make their new effort is, have a new, kind of like a new defense point along this tree line, along kind of right in front. You see these kind of tree lines to the outskirts of the western part of Stepova. Have it there. Have it along this tree line, and kind of have this secure bridgehead on the other side of the western rail line, because then they'll have a secure line of defense. And I expect from that point that the Russians will probably try to advance more to the south, probably try to gain, along this road, try to get in this tree line here. They don't need to take Berdichi. The whole, this is where the Ukrainians supply Avdiivka, but they don't need to continuously go west. They just need to go south and continue developing their offensive here. They'll also probably do direct attacks on Berdichi just to pin down Ukrainian forces here, because if they don't, and the Russians try to instead just go south and try to start occupying this area, this flat area, the Ukrainians can use Berdichi as an attack point to slow down the Russians. So the Russians need to pin down the Ukrainians here. The Battle of Stepova is still going on. I'm not saying it's over yet. I'm just trying to explain what the Russians are trying to do. But we'll see by the end of this week if they're able to hold this game, because the Russians were in Stepova before, but the Ukrainians kept doing counterattacks. But there's been a serious attack on trying to take Stepova. So we'll see if the Russians can actually secure their gains here. Russians are also advancing more north towards Novokilonova. They managed to occupy more parts of this tree line to the south of it. Again, the purpose of advancing kind of along this rail line and advancing here is to secure Russian gains to the north, because the Ukrainians not only are attacking directly near Berdichi, they're also having troops along this northern front and trying to, because this part right here to the north is, the Russians are advancing here, and the Ukrainians have a chance to attack here in order to slow down the Russians, who are obviously advancing to try to encircle Avdiivka. So Avdiivka is, the Russians are on the offensive everywhere on this front. They are advancing to the south directly, and to the north. They are trying to envelop Avdiivka as usual, and they are also attacking Avdiivka directly to pin down Ukrainian forces here. So if they manage to secure Stepova and they manage to enter Severna and take it as well, then that's another big nail in the hammer for the AFU defense. They won't be completely cut off at that point, but it's just a ticking time bomb till then, or ticking time, just like a clock down, tick. The time's going down before they lose Avdiivka. So Avdiivka is the main part, and again, as I mentioned, they're trying to capture Avdiivka and push the Ukrainians back on this line to the Karakova line, as I call it, so they could push Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk. As part of that operation, so there's the northern, this is part of the big Donetsk front. Another big news today was the complete capture of Marinka by Russian forces. There was geolocated footage. I don't know exactly which building, but basically, like in these buildings right here, there was a Russian flag here, meaning that not only did a Russian troop came here, placed a flag, and it's usually like if there's a back and forth, you don't put a flag there. You could say maybe Russian troops are here, but then the AFU comes in, the Russians take back. But the fact that there's they managed to just leisurely be able to place a flag here is basically shows that the AFU withdrew from the westernmost edges of Marinka. As I mentioned last video, I believe that this is, obviously this is big symbolic importance. One thing I will mention is that some sources are saying that Marinka is not completely captured. It's like 95% captured, but the Ukrainians are for example, there's still some Ukrainians on this area here, and it's like, where does the village of Grigor end or begin, and where does Marinka end? This is kind of between. But for the most part, 95%, 100%, we could basically say that Marinka is captured. So is there any, besides symbolically, because this has been a battle that's been going on since the beginning of the war, is this the end? Well, no, the Russians still have to push the Ukrainians back, and because, as I mentioned, basically, it's not like this is a big tactical defeat. It's more symbolic than anything. However, this allows the Russians to then consolidate and continue their push towards probably along this kind of natural lake area. They're probably going to try to take. They're not going to directly attack Grigorivka immediately, but they'll probably start focusing on this northern edge here, try to take these tree lines here and such. Not only will this get to the south of Krasnokodnivka here, which will help develop Russian offensive operations here, they'll be able to get how do you say it? They'll also be able to start getting to the north of Grigorivka here. So I expect probably the Russians to clear this area, kind of secure themselves right outside of Grigorivka, and also try to start focusing here. And the end goal being to try to take this village. But this is probably a long way out. So that's one thing to mention. They finally captured Marinka. That's a big symbolic goal. This is, again, part of the whole purpose is to push Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk. So the Russians are pushing in the south and in the north and trying to push the Ukrainians back towards probably this line here. Another place of Russian offensive operations to mention is on the Bakhmut front. This is where another big also, if before I always forget this. This is the Rybar map I use obviously the other maps for the map I use is different from the Rybar map. So this is Rybar's map for Avdiivka. We could see these dark red areas or light red areas, I should say. Are in contrast to the dark. So this is what the gains that the Russians have gained since the last update, and so the Russians are as you can see, they're trying to advance to the north of Stepova, and you can see the advances of the Russians here near Servada. So we'll see. So this is where the progress is. I think there's also a Marinka one. No, I think that's it. So yeah, that's the Avdiivka one. So let's go to Bakhmut. In Bakhmut, the Russians are now on the offensive on both fronts. So this used to be an area where the Russians were on the defense, but now, as we mentioned in the last few weeks, the Russians are on the attack. The biggest gains are in the north. One of the biggest changes is that the Russians launched an offensive and captured the village of Kromova. This is one interesting thing about this is that this is an area even Wagner did not even take. So far, all Russian progress on this area has been to recapture, bring back the situation to where it was after the fall of Bakhmut in May. However, after that happened, the village of then the Ukrainians began their attack again. But what's interesting about the capture of Kromova is that this was never under Russian hands. So before, all these lands used to be part of the Russian gains in Bakhmut, but they were taken during when the Ukrainians were trying to advance towards Berfivka and Yadidna. But now they managed they were recapturing it, and the capture of Kromova is the first gain that the Russians never had. So this gain in Kromova allows the Russians to continue their advance towards the village of Ivanivska. I expect some sort of they're probably going to use this as a launching point to start clearing out, advancing along the 00506 road here, and try to basically reach this cemetery and secure themselves here, because the purpose of this area is to try to get closer to Ivanivska. Ivanivska is the main linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut. Not defenses, but offensive operations. They use this to support troops here, and if this falls, then the Ukrainians will have to stop basically any effort to take Bakhmut, and they'll fall back to Chasiv Yar. So we're now seeing that, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, but let me continue. So they managed to take the village of Kromova. They also the Russians are also starting in advance to take the village of Bogdanovka here. They haven't entered the village yet, but the Russians are now improving their positions to the outskirts of the village. During this week, they managed to capture this tree line here. I'm expecting probably they're going to take this tree line and try to, dare I say, probably even basically try to enter the village itself, because this is a village they need to take. Now, one hard part about this is that this is an extremely elongated village, so the capture of this village will not, they don't have to take the whole village. They might only take the northern or central part. Another thing that the Russians have been trying to advance is this forest nursery, they call it. This forest, they grow trees here and chop them down for wood, I believe. So the Russians are now battling over this area right here along this rail line. Obviously, the purpose is to capture this and continue their offensive towards this area, try to advance here, because then they could attack Bogdanovka from the side and not just from the north. So the Russians are improved their positions to the outskirts of the northern part of Bogdanovka. They are battling for this forest nursery, where if they capture it, they could then flank attack Bogdanovka from the west, and also improve the flank of Kromino, so they could maybe move the front line more to the west. So that maybe like what they're hoping to do probably is to take the northern part of Bogdanovka, have the front line be along this tree line, and the Russians will then be here, and then they'll be on the right outside in the northern part of Ivanivska here. Another thing to mention is in the southern part is that while the Russians have basically re-secured themselves along the rail line, advances here are not as, for this week at least, haven't been as intense as the northern part, with the capture of Kromina, advancing on Bogdanovka, and so forth. But the Russians are, I just want to mention that the Russians are advancing here, and the main focus is to capture the strategic heights of Klishchiivka. You could see that the Ukrainians put a big trench network here to secure themselves here. And the main purpose of that is that, and so the Russian efforts are now trying to fight over this, getting closer to the this tree line here, this forest belt, and the whole purpose is to take the heights here, and then basically the Ukrainians in this area, in the Klishchiivka itself, will fall back, and basically fall back to the canal. And if Klishchiivka falls, then Andriivka will fall naturally as well. Basically, they were trying to recapture all the lands lost during the Ukrainians' offensive in Bakhmut in the summer. And once they capture Klishchiivka and Andriivka, they're going to make the new line along the Sovietsky-Donetsk Canal for defensive purposes. And then not only that, they'll be outside in the southern part of Ivanivska. So that's where the Wagner was before they started getting pushed back. However, if the Russians are successful in the northern part and advance to where you see my my mouse pointer here, if they manage to go here, then they'll also be on the northern part. So then, not only that, they'll be able to attack Ivanivska from two sides, and hopefully then finally capture this village for good. And so once this village is taken, the goal will be, now I'm going to look at the bigger picture of Bakhmut. I don't think they're going to start the battle for Chasiv Yar. One reason is because Chasiv Yar is on a hill. This is the high point here. And so the Russians are going to be in a big disadvantage to try to take it directly. I expect they're going to try to envelop Chasiv Yar from the sides, but that's going to be for later. Right now, they still need to take and stop all AFU attempts to be outside Bakhmut forever. So they'll continue battling for the heights of Klishevka so they could take the southern part. They'll continue advancing to improve their positions near Bogdanovka, so then they could get to the north of Ivanivska. And then if those two things happen successfully, they'll be able to attack on two sides and take this village. And then push the AFU and make a new defense line along the canal. I expect at that point they'll probably do an offensive operation to try to take this village of this village right here, just to get themselves along the canal. The main thing I'm interested in is if, they'll probably take Kalina here, probably. Yeah, they'll probably try to, take this village or at least get close here. But one thing is that one big fortification for Chasiv Yar is this area right here. You can see all the tall, high-rise buildings here. So this is going to be a very hard spot for the Ukrainians. But I bet if Ivanivska falls and the Russians are now on the southern part of Bogdanovka and they're now advancing closer here, I could see the Russians just blowing up this bridge here and just cutting off the Ukrainians here. So that, this is a good fortification, but this could be razed to the ground pretty easily. But this is a strong point that will prevent the Russians from fully developing themselves along the canal. So I think one part of the Russian winter offensive is going to try to be to reach this canal. So, but we still have to see them take the Klishevka Heights. We still have to see them improve their positions near Bogdanovka and take at least the northern part of it. We still need to see them take Ivanivska. So there's a lot of steps the Russians are wanting to do, but I wanted to go over what the Russians are actually trying to do, which is reach this Donbass Canal and then secure themselves so that maybe later on next year they could begin they could have a better position to start the battle for Chasiv Yar. So that's that, and then let's begin. Another place where the Russians are on the offensive is on what I call the Luhansk front. Or the Oskol front. Let us begin with the northern part near Kupiansk. The Russians restarted offensive operations, and they actually managed to enter a lot of sources. If we see here's the Rybar map for Bakhmut. You could see that the Russians are trying to advance to the heights of Klishevka here. We also could see the Russian advancements closer to Bogdanovka and closer to, and also the capture of Kromova here. So there's that. And then if we look at the Kupiansk front, we can see that the Russians entered the northern outskirts of Sinkovka. This village forms the linchpin for the northern defense, and it's the forest line near the Oskol River. This forms the northern defense point of Kupiansk. As long as the AFU controls this forest and this village, the Russians cannot begin operations to start clearing Kupiansk or begin assaulting Kupiansk. So, because they're so far away, the Russian, right now it's hard for the Russians to strike this with regular stuff beyond missiles and such. But the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to this position so the Russians aren't right on the doorstep of Kupiansk and they could shell this village intensely. And this village has been battled over for months now, so it's very much destroyed. But I believe if you scroll down, can't see the destruction yet. But basically, a lot of sources say this week the Russians entered this northern part of Sinkovka, but we'll have to see if they'll be able to hold it, because there's always been sources that they say they captured it. Sometimes they say they haven't. But a lot of sources are saying they actually managed to enter the northern outskirts of Sinkovka. So we'll have to see how this develops here, but I think they might be pushed back out because this is how the game works here. But if they manage to capture this village, then that helps the Russians to continue clearing this forest and start reaching the outskirts of Kupiansk. Along with this, the Russians are they managed to capture a hill here. I believe it's this hill here, and along with this advances toward the south of Ivanivka, they're probably gonna what they're trying to do is break this triangle of well, it's not really a triangle, but this how do you say it? This like line of defenses. This is one of the main Ukrainian defenses here, because as long as if this defense holds, the Russians will never reach the southern part of Kupiansk. The Russians are pushing to the north to reach the northern part of Kupiansk, and then they want to break this defense line so that they could advance through the open fields and reach the outskirts of the southern part of Kupiansk, so that then the Russians will be in a semicircle around Kupiansk, and then the Battle of Kupiansk can begin. But before that, they need to take these outskirts defense points that the AFU has, that the Ukrainians have. The AFU is the Ukrainians. So the northern part, there's a lot of advances. The Russians are still advancing in this area, but again, progress is slow. But yeah, so there's been some advances. But one of the biggest advances has actually been in the south, in the part of the Luhansk front, what they call the Liman front. The Russians started a broad frontline attack along this area and took this tree line, this like forest belt here, and this tree line. So, and basically trying to reach the Zierbets River. The Russians, for basically almost a year now, have had a well, maybe not a year, but almost a year, have been called what they call the Torskoye salient, because the Russians are right on the outskirts of Torskoye, but everyone else in here, it's a salient, because in the south, it's the Ukrainians and Russians are still fighting over the forest, the Sierbransky forest. And then in the north, the Ukrainians and Russians are basically in this open fields along the Luhansk-Donetsk border here. But here, the Russians advance and have the salient. So the Ukrainians are on the north and south of the Russians, and so they can continue attacking the salient. And Russian positions in this salient are very hard to secure. So this offensive is probably to liquidate this bridgehead the Ukrainians have on the Zierbets River. The Zierbets River, it goes along this entire front line, and the Russians are trying to reach it for better defensive purposes, but it's also a first step to reaching the main Russian goal, which is reaching the Oskol River. So the Russians made a broad frontline attack and are advancing near and trying to basically take these villages of Terny, Yamkovka, but in order to do so, they need to take the Ukrainian positions that have been here for months now, so they're very well defended, but they advanced here. They took this forest belt. They took this tree line. So it's very that was a major advance here, but they still need to advance more and get closer to these villages. So again, the purpose of all this is to reach the Oskol River, take Kupiansk, take Liman for supply purposes, and because these are strong logistic points. But it's a meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer battle, and just to improve the tactical positioning. So this is something that I think another part of the Russian winter offensive will be to try to reach the Oskol River here. But again, the first to do that, they need to reach the Zierbets River, and in order to do that, they need to clear out the Ukrainian bridgehead here, which will take time. So the Russians are on the offensive here, but again, it's there's been some progress, but nothing like any collapse yet or anything, but there's been advances that are to mention. Another thing to mention is there's been no changes on the South Donetsk area here. The Russians are still trying to take the one last hill near Starmayorska. When this hill gets taken, I think this hill is like somewhere here. The Russians will be able to finally cut Starmayorska off, and then they'll probably assault it, take it, and then once Starmayorska falls, Urzhina will probably fall. And the Russian goal here will probably just take these two villages, just to level the front. And then if we go to Zaporozhye front, there's not been as much changes here. However, in the Zaporozhye front, the Ukrainians are on the attack, not as much as intensely. They've actually been withdrawing troops away from Zaporozhye. But I just wanted to mention that there's been some movement here. The Ukrainians are trying to advance to the west of Robotyne. The purpose of this is to try to gain, they're trying to battle over this tree line right here. They're trying to get to Kopany because this secures their flank on the western part. And another thing is that when the Ukrainians were here, they were trying to get to the south of Verbova, but that failed pretty spectacular. That failed. So they're now focusing on the north of Verbova. So they've been trying to attack these tree lines. They're trying to push the Russians back from these tree lines and then get to the north of Verbova. Because then if they take Verbova and take these tree lines, they secure themselves on the east. And then again, all of the Ukrainian purposes here is to secure this salient that they developed. And they're not trying to make a breakthrough to Tokmak. They are simply here to, they're just basically trying to improve their defensive posture here, while the Russians are trying to retake this entire salient and regain the lands they lost during the offensive. So that's where the fighting is. I just wanted to point where the Ukrainians are still pushing, but there wasn't any. There was like some advances. They're now clashing over this tree line, but again, it's every week it's like a tree line they're battling over, and the purpose is to improve the salient. So no big breakthroughs, no big changes, but the fighting is still going on. There's been some small little pushes, by the Ukrainians, but nothing major, just like in the Luhansk front. But the battles and clashes and some changes are there, so they're worth noting. Lastly, on the Kherson front, there's no changes. It's the same as every week, but I just want to mention, because battles are still going on, the Ukrainians are still in the middle of Krinky. The Russians bombed this with fab bombs, with artillery. The Ukrainians use this village right here, Chinyevka, as the main logistic hub, and they then send it to. They use speedboats to try to land supplies and send reinforcements. I still don't know what the purpose of this is. I think it's PR, apparently, but I still think the Ukrainians aren't dumb. I think they will try to make another main attack somewhere, or maybe that was the whole purpose, just to make a PR thing to say, hey, we're actually attacking somewhere, or maybe smaller, they're just trying to drag forces away from Zaporozhye. So, just wanted to mention that the battle for Krinky still goes on. The Ukrainians are still in the village, but the Russians are bombing it heavily, and there's been no changes on this front, besides maybe, like, building by building. Maybe there's, sometimes the Russians take a few buildings, maybe the Ukrainians manage to enter the southern part of the northern part of this forest or something. So some movement, but it's very little. It's negligible. It's just the Ukrainians made a daring operation almost 2 months ago, took the center of this village, and then basically are now just trying to hold it. But no big changes. It wasn't like they managed to expand that bridgehead, or the Russians managed to take this village back. So that's the end of this video. A few other things to mention. The Russians are now restarting their missile campaign. Now, they're not with missiles. They're using their Shahed drones. They've been attacking certain targets around Ukraine with the Shahed drones. I think those are just to test Ukrainian air defense before they do their main missile campaign later in the winter. Another thing is there's been a lot of back and forth in Ukraine between Zelensky and his general Zaluzhny. They both have different ideas on they have this political deadlock. There's also been a lot of people are speaking out against Zelensky, the mayor of Kiev, the mayor of one of the past Ukrainian presidents, Poroshenko. They've all been going against Zelensky because they think, after the failure of the counteroffensive, they see weakness in him. And so there's, Zaluzhny is also trying to make a bit, he's kind of been the more anti-Zelensky faction. And so there's been this back and forth between the Ukrainian political elites as they're trying to get more Ukrainian, the Western arms have been drying up. The counteroffensive failed, so now there's been blaming going back and forth. And so that's turmoil on the political front. On the Russian political front, Putin signed the budget for 2024 with a massive increase for the military. 30% of the entire Russian military budget is on military spending, while if you include military and security services and such, it's about 40%. So a big chunk of the Russia is going on the war footing, and this war is still attritional, it's still positional, but the Russians are now on the offensive, basically along most of the entire front, and the Ukrainians are just having to. And as Zelensky stated, they are now on the defense. They are now moving towards the defensive posture until they get more aid from the West. So that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. This was a long video, but it's there's been clashes along the entire front. That's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you liked it, please give this video a like and share this video around. Comment your thoughts. And if you make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. So aim high and wander on.